Okay, this is Jason Van Tatenhove, and I'm here with Cliff Gardner, who is a rancher out of Nevada. And Cliff is a friend of my co-host Jim White, and has done several videos there. But Cliff turns out to be one of the most um, having one of the best document stores that I have come across regarding use issues here in the West. Cliff, thanks for joining me today. And can you please introduce yourself and give our listeners and readers a little introduction about yourself and how you came to this type of research?
Well, the Gardners uh, migrated to the United States in the 1800s and kicked around, did different things, and eventually ended up in Nevada and settling in the 1880s. I'm a fourth generation rancher, and of course, living in northern Nevada at high altitudes. The only real opportunity early on was to take up land and go into the ranching business, which we've been doing ever since. And of course, then as I came along and grew up, I instinctively knew that that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to run cattle and break horses and do all the things that you do in a ranching operation. But when I became involved, it wasn't long until I learned that there wasn't much of a future because of adverse actions that were being put forward by the governmental agencies. To give a little background, what that means is that in Nevada we took up homesteads where we could irrigate some land and pasture, but it wasn't nearly enough to sustain enough livestock to make a living. And so it became a custom in western United States, of course, that everybody began running livestock on the open and unclaimed lands, later administrated by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. And these people, for some reason, it took me years to understand why, but these people seem to want to justify their existence, and so they carry on a constant campaign, always talking about overgrazing, and I suppose they have to have a victim, a dragon to slay in order to maintain their budgets or increase their budgets and justify their existence. But it's created an extreme hardship for those in the ranching industry over all the years. I'm a man in late 70s now, and so for most of my lifetime, our greatest problem has been dealing with the adverse actions of and the false propaganda of people within Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management. And so beginning as a young man, beginning in the 1980s, I determined that I was going to collect all the information I possibly could that indicated that what these people were doing was not in fact benefiting wildlife, but in fact not only hurting ranching families, but hurting the habitats and hurting the wildlife as well. And so that's where much of my endeavor has been since that time.
And where did you
in
gather?
collecting all this data.
Well,
Go ahead.
when you say you gathered that information, from what sources did you gather that information?
Well, at that time in the 1980s, I was in communication with a lot of other people that were concerned throughout the western United States. And so many of them were also trying to find solutions, and they were gathering information. And so I kept articles out of publications, newspapers, trade magazines, and then also was collecting data that was accomplished by other persons in the livestock industry or in the timber industry or even sportsmen that were concerned across Western America. And then later on became, of course, involved in lawsuits supporting lawsuits, being involved in litigation myself, and I, for a long period of time, educated myself as much as possible with regards to the legal aspects. Also became involved and studied with Cleon Skousen, was a Century Club supporter of that organization, the Freeman Institute, and so tried to learn as much as I could about the objectives of the founders of this country and what they tried to incorporate within our style of government and why they incorporated that. And so I've put together all that information, or as much of it as I could, over the years. So now, quite possibly, I really don't think that there's anybody that has as large a library regarding the history of public land settlement and all the laws that entail court cases involving public land issues in the western United States. And so I'm not a wealthy person. We're not a wealthy family, but we try to contribute our part, do our part as much as possible in getting the truth out.
Well, Cliff, can we talk about the Golden Butte area and give us a little bit of history? Back in 1989, I believe it was, when the designation of the desert tortoise as an endangered species, which had a pretty dramatic effect on the families that were ranching cattle back then. Can you tell us a little bit about what things were like before that designation and how we find them now?
Well, it was a time in my experience where I was doing a lot of research in regards to the effects of predator control. I had learned that historically all the earliest explorers, trappers, those that entered into the West in the 1800s from Lewis and Clark forward, actually found very little game. Some of them starved. Many of them had to eat their horses in order to survive in many of the basins and valleys of the western United States. And so it was about this same time the Bureau of Land Management was putting forth a new effort to modify their resource management plan within the state line resource management area in southern Nevada. And being acquainted with one of the attorneys that was being involved with one of the issues that was coming forward with regards to desert tortoise, she asked me to do Pacific research into the history of that area. And so I traveled to southern Nevada, became acquainted with many of the people that were being adversely affected at that time, including the Bundy family. And this is in the late 1980s. And I welcomed the opportunity because it tied in closely with what research I was doing with regards to northern Nevada, the effects of crow predation and effects of coyote predation primarily on different species. And so I had the opportunity. I first collected all of the earliest logs and diaries regarding the exploration of that region, and I found very similar to what was going on in our region, northern Nevada and elsewhere in the western United States, that the first explorers found there was no mention, absolutely no mention of desert tortoise being in that region. The Indians talked about desert tortoise a bit, but those people, most of them traveling west from New Mexico, would purchase a flock of sheep and extra horses so that if they tried to make it through southern Nevada or Arizona, reach California, they would have enough source of animals to supplement their rations in order to make it. But still, many of them went days and days without sufficient food to eat or finding any kind of game. So that pretty well indicated that the desert tortoise that were then abundant, then being at the time the controversies arose, were products of livestock grazing, livestock impacts. And so then I went around, traveled around the area, southern Nevada, and interviewed a lot of the old ranchers, trappers, people that hunted and fished in that area, and put together several affidavits, and they all testified to the great abundance of tortoises that were found right at the very time when we were experiencing the greatest numbers of livestock, sheep and cattle being run on the rangelands. And even the science, I was finding science, became acquainted with an older fellow that had been in research, spent his life working for forest research stations, and at one time supervised the one in Silver City, New Mexico, and had been directly involved, and he had uncovered as much scientific information as he could find, and he lent that to me, and that information was showing what I was finding from the testimonies and the historical records, that when livestock are out on the public lands, they graze the forbs and the grasses, and then those plants will renew themselves and grow anew and fresh, and it's those fine leaves that the tortoise were dependent upon. Well, Karen Budd, who turned out to be the attorney for the cowboys down there, that was when there was over 50 of these families that were being adversely affected. They were being told by the Bureau of Land Management people that they were going to have to remove their livestock from the ranges for at least 50% of the time of the year. They had hired Karen Budd, and Karen approached me and asked if I would put that research together, and so I put together a document, and it was quite interesting. One of those things I wanted to reveal, make people aware of, was that in 1986, the Nevada Department of Wildlife did a survey of the status of desert tortoise in the southern area, southern portion of Nevada. And they determined that at that time there were 40,000 of these tortoises living within the city limits of Las Vegas and the other metropolitan areas and cities and towns within Clark County. And it turned out their estimate of between 40 to 90 tortoises average per acre within that region, within tortoise habitat. 25% of the tortoises were living within city limits. 25%, even though only 11% of that territory was within those bounds. In other words, 11% of the territory had been encroached on by city development, but they were then producing, or at least 25% of the tortoises that were then living were living within the city limits. But then there was all this rhetoric coming forward from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management people, saying that the cities were, and the activities of mankind were detrimental to the tortoise. They had to be listed, and so they accomplished that. And as a result, they forced the Clark County to become involved and pass regulation whereby every contractor that did development within that area had to pay $550 an acre into a tortoise fund. Plus, there was millions of dollars being raised as mitigation fees from miners and from people that were putting in businesses and so forth. And all that money was going into the tortoise fund. And so I became curious. It looked to me like it was all fraud, corruption, and only for purposes of advancing the coffers of those in government. And so with the help of others that were living in the area, we did a little research, sent in some FOIA requests, and found out that in the first 10 years, they raised $100 million, and that $100 million went to the Nevada Department of Wildlife, the BLM, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the University of Nevada, Sierra Club, and Nature Conservancy. They were all getting rich. It was all for purposes of supplementing the incomes. It was the greatest boom that could have ever occurred with regards to increasing the budgets and the expenditures for those people in government. And so I've followed that scenario on for all these years, and it's only, I estimate now, we were able to get much of the data from Clark County for a period of time as to how much their incomes were with regard to this issue. But then, here more recently, they have ceased allowing us to access any of their information. But all the data that we have covered to this time indicates that there's been $200 million raised since 1990 when this fiasco first came
Cliff,
down in southern Nevada.
wouldn't those records be a matter of public record, that these are public agencies, and shouldn't that be available to us as the citizens?
Well, what they told us, Harry Pappas, a friend of mine in Las Vegas, and I were working on this particular effort, and the responsible people there at Clark County told us that they didn't have a summation of all that information, and it was all kind of in disorganized disarray within a back room they had down there, and if we wanted to, we could come in and sort it all out. And I suppose we could do that, but we've never felt that we had the time to go and do that. So we're just using the information we have at this time to pass
And
on to the
how old is
public.
that information that you do have?
Oh, the last communication with Terry was just, I think 2.5 years ago.
Okay, so it's fairly recent.
It's fairly recent, yes. But of course, what was comprehensive of what we did receive was probably more than 10 years old. So we don't have good records for the last 10 years, basically.
Okay. Cliff.
And then I should also mention that last year I sent a FOIA request off to the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the Bureau of Land Management, asking for all data indicating that what the monitoring data of desert tortoise populations was. Because I was seeing articles come out where officials representing the Fish and Wildlife Service were saying that the tortoise populations were dropping precipitously, using their terms. And so I sent these FOIA requests off. I got no response from the Bureau of Land Management, but the Fish and Wildlife Service did respond and sent me something like 76 documents, I believe. So I spent 2 or 3 weeks going through that. And now, before I mentioned that at the time when the tortoise was being declared as a threatened species in southern Nevada, they estimated that the average tortoise population was from 40 to 90 tortoises per square mile. Now, and all the data that I've reviewed in recent months indicates that tortoise populations have dropped, whereby if biologists find 8 to 9 tortoises per square mile, on average, they're doing well. And so what it all amounts to is, not only is this extortion and fraud perpetrated on the American people and the people of the state of Nevada, but also, as is occurring with regard to other species across the western United States, the actions of these government agencies is causing tortoise populations to decrease rapidly, precipitously.
So, do you believe that's in relation to the decrease in the cattle ranching in the area?
Yes, the plants are not as healthy. They've become decadent, unproductive, and but also, in addition, they've discontinued all predator control practices. Raven populations have increased some places 700 times by government data, and these species just they devastate. They thrive on young tortoise. There was data that was uncovered at the time of all the controversy when the tortoise was being proposed for listing, where biologists came in. Harry Pappas was appointed to one of the boards by Barbara Fikevich, our representative to Congress. And Harry was testified later that there was biologists came in from California, having researched the issues and the status of tortoise in the Mojave Desert, whereby they had picked up hundreds of small tortoise carcasses underneath crow's nests. So they knew the effect of ravens and crows on young tortoises, but they ignored that for purposes of, well, really what happens is when they designate an endangered species, that takes the management control out from under the authority of state government that places it in under the Fish and Wildlife Service, a federal agency, and they wanted that control, and so they knew the truth, but those populations of crows and ravens have only increased dramatically since that time of listing because of actions taken by our federal agencies, diminishing predator control and raven control and coyote control.
So, in your opinion, what is the reason those 50 plus families since 1989 and the designation of the desert tortoise, why are we down to now one family that now is effectively being um, stopped from all ranching based on this designation of Golden Butte as a national monument, and obviously the actions that were taken back in 2014?
Well, nearly all of the people that were in the ranching business in Clark County at the time this all began were small family ranchers. There was only one or two that were a little larger. But there's not a lot of money in ranching. Those of us that are in ranching are dedicated to a way of life. And so uh, when the government takes adverse action against our operations, in other words, they come in and they say, oh, you're going to have to remove your cattle from your allotments for 6 months out of the year. That's similar to the government coming in and saying, oh, Mr. Jones, you have a bakery, but you're only going to operate 50% of the year this year. And so Mr. Jones looks at his situation. He can't hire employees for 50% of the year very well and pay them a decent wage. And he looks at the bottom line, and he can't, because he's competing with other people across the country, he cannot survive. He won't have enough income to pay his debts and pay his operating costs, so he goes out of business. So that's what happened in the Las Vegas area, when everyone went out of business except the Clive and Bundy family. Cliven was just strong-minded enough that he said no. He and his neighbor, Keith Ney, had gone back in trying to find solutions and studied the Constitution and studied federal law and studied court cases, and they determined that that what the government was doing was unconstitutional. They were not being afforded the right of due process, whereby they could go before an unbiased tribunal and prove that what the government was doing would not benefit the tortoises. That's what due process is all about when you understand what the founders of this country were trying to accomplish. And so they determined that the only way they were to survive in the ranching business was to just put their livestock out without a permit, just to continue. as was the intent under the Constitution, the federal government was not supposed to retain that much land or any land after statehood. It was supposed to pass to the state. And under state and common law, grazing rights are recognized. And if that had been the case, then the Bundys and all of their neighbors, including Keith and Marilyn May, would have continued ranching. But that wasn't what was happening. And so Clive and Keith determined that they were just going to put their cattle out. Well, Keith, being an older man, passed away quite a number of years ago. And his wife, not being able to muster what it takes to fight the government, she just sold off all of her cattle, but that left Cliven. So he was the only remaining rancher, as you often hear, that still continued to run cattle upon the public lands following the adverse action of the Bureau of Land Management.
What has the economic impact on the community been with the loss of these small ranching families?
Well, to a degree, the loss has not been that great to the local community, because as we in the ranching businesses of the West have been oppressed and we've had to face these adverse actions, the economic returns have not been that great. So we have to live pretty tight. And when a business is run in that manner, you don't pump a lot of money back into the economy. In northern Nevada here, a lot of the slack has been taken up by the gold mines. Gold was discovered in the 1970s and then began to be developed in the 1980s. And we have some of the largest gold mines in the country that employ an awful lot of people. And that is kind of shoved agriculture back in the background. But one of the things that's not being measured is the effect on rangelands. I talked a little bit earlier about the positive effects of grazing impact. Well, there has been scientific studies completed by different universities early on that shows when livestock impact brushlands and grasslands, that stimulates their growth and makes them more productive. And so that not only affects ranching, but it also affects recreation, particularly in the area of wildlife production. Let me back up a little bit. Talk a little bit about mule deer. Historically, as the first explorers came into this country, they didn't even mention mule deer. They heard, by talking to the Indians, a little bit about mountain sheep being on the mountains. But in 20 years of exploration, I only found 2 instances where the trappers and explorers themselves actually saw mountain sheep, bighorn sheep. But then, surprisingly, after we put livestock up on the range, cattle and sheep, and there became a political process for mostly stemming from the politics of the sheep industry to control predators, all of a sudden, beginning in the 1920s and then into the 30s, mule deer and sage grouse began to explode in number. Well, when I was a young man, I liked to hunt. My family liked to hunt mule deer. We liked to hunt sage grouse. And it was unbelievable the number of mule deer and sage grouse that were in the country. Just this morning, I was reading a summary that was written by a biologist that worked for the federal government in predator control. And he was saying in the 1950s, when they were flying fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, they had to be very careful, because if they got too close to the ground in some places, that there were so many sage grouse would fly up that they would endanger the aircraft. And so then beginning in the late 1950s, and particularly then in the 1970s, as environmentalism became popular across the United States, the agency people started implementing restrictions on predator control practices, particularly on public lands, federal lands, so-called federal lands. They did not allow the hunting of predatory animals except in cases where it could be absolutely proved that a coyote, for example, had killed a lamb or a calf or something to that nature. And so it wasn't long until the sheep then were going out of business. And where we used to run nearly 1 million sheep in the state of Nevada, now we have 200,000 or 300,000 head of sheep. And there's just not enough political clout within the livestock industry to sustain or to counter all of the environmental people that want to protect coyotes, ravens, wolves, and all of those things. And so as a consequence, deer herd and sage grouse numbers have just plummeted. They just dropped to practically nothing as compared to the numbers that were evident in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so that is kind of a benefit to the agency people that want to gain more control over the public lands and put forth their agendas, because now they can say, oh, well, look at the livestock number, look at the sage grouse numbers, and the tortoise numbers are dropping dramatically, and so we have to list them, and gives us more control over all of the wildlife and more money for our coffers. And they blame it continually on ranching and talk about overgrazing, when in truth they have absolutely no science that supports their rhetoric, their disinformation, their propaganda, and on it goes.
Well, Cliff, is there anything you'd like to add that you haven't touched on yet?
No, that's the best summary that I can give of the history of politics in Western America with regards to public land management primarily. If the first one to go into detail, I can talk about any of the issues. Now we're facing the sage grouse issue here in northern Nevada, which is going to give the federal agency people carte blanche control over 60% of the state, and it's already enabled them to raise vast amounts. I talked to people representing the Nevada Department of Wildlife. Now 50% of their people are working on that specific issue. And so it's just a bigger fiasco than occurred with regards to desert tortoise in southern Nevada. So anyway, you or anybody can help get that information out. Of course, government has all the money in the world, and we don't. And so people hear constantly of all of the adversity in the private sector, but they never hear the truth about what's really causing the problem here in Western America. So if you or any of your colleagues can help us in that regard, not only will it benefit we in the livestock industry, but it'll help wildlife. I often say that if sage grouse could talk, they'd be at all of our meetings, and they'd be hollering from the rooftops saying, get rid of the Department of Wildlife, get rid of the BLM, get rid of the Forest Service. They're destroying our habitat. They're causing us to become very few in number. But that's not our situation. So any way you can help us, we greatly appreciate it.
Well, Cliff, we'll certainly be speaking with you again about these topics. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today and help me get this information figured out and put out there.
Thank you for all you're doing.